The wind had a name in Texas in the year of our Lord, 1887. In the town of Dust Haven, people called it the Devil's Breath. It was a constant presence, a restless spirit that scoured the plains, peeling paint from the slat wood buildings and carrying the grit of the earth into every corner of a person's life. It tasted of baked soil and distant sorrow. From his vantage point on the low rise overlooking the town, Sheriff Eli Carter felt the wind tug at his hat, a familiar and unwelcome hand. He settled it lower on his brow, the brim-shading eyes that had seen too much sun and far too much of human nature. Below him, Dust Haven baked in the merciless heat. It was not so much a town as a raw settlement clinging to life, a collection of tired buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent expanse of scorched grass and endless sky. The air hung thick with the smells of summer, the metallic tang of cattle blood from the butcher's yard and the sharp, salty scent of human sweat. This was a place where law was a new idea, a concept as fragile as a pane of glass in a hailstorm. Eli was that glass, and he felt the storm was always just over the horizon. His gaze drifted from the squat shape of the saloon to the general store, then past the church, its steeple a lonely finger pointing toward a brassy, unforgiving heaven. He was looking for something he knew he would not find. A ghost. A memory. 10 years it had been since Mary was taken from him, not by sickness or accident, but by fire and fear. The same fear he could feel simmering now in the dusty streets below. The townspeople, in their simple, brutal wisdom, had decided a sickness that swept through their cattle was the work of some dark influence. Mary, who knew her herbs and remedies, who was kind to a fault, became the focus of their terror. A barn fire, a tragic accident, but the whispers had already done their work. They said it was a sign. Eli knew it was just fire, a mindless, hungry thing. But in a town starved for answers, superstition was a feast. A shrill cry cut through the low moan of the wind, pulling him from the past. A group of children were clustered near the edge of town, their small forms stark against the parched landscape. They were pointing, their voices thin and cruel. Witch! Witch! Eli's eyes followed their aim to a lone figure moving along the dry riverbed that marked the town's desolate edge. It was Lila Marin. Even from this distance, he could see the isolation that clung to her like a shroud. She lived apart from everyone in a small, weathered hut propped against the riverbank, a place most folks avoided as if it were plagued. They called her the Cursed Witch, a title she had earned through nothing more than misfortune and the town's need for a scapegoat. He had the story in pieces, gathered from the guarded mutterings of men in the saloon and the sharp whispers of women over their fences. She had arrived 2 years prior, a quiet young woman with eyes the color of a stormy sky, the first man to take a public interest in her. A young ranch hand named Thomas was thrown from his horse and broke his neck not a week later. The second, a trapper who shared a meal with her, was found dead in his sleep, his heart having simply given out. The third, a drifter who tried to force his attentions on her, was bitten by a rattlesnake not 100 yards from her door. 3 men, 3 sudden deaths. To the people of Dust Haven, it was not coincidence. It was a curse, a clear and terrible warning. Anyone who helps Lila meets with disaster, the saying went. It had become a local gospel. Eli did not believe in curses. He believed in bad luck, foolish choices, and the simple, unforgiving nature of life in the West. A spirited horse, a weak heart, a misplaced step in the dark. These were the true demons of this land. Yet, as he watched Lila bend to pick up a piece of driftwood, her movements weary and graceful, an unwelcome chill traced its way down his spine. He had seen her up close a few times in the general store. She moved with a silence that was unnerving, and her gaze, when it happened to meet another's, was filled with a profound and ancient sadness. It was a look that seemed to know the bitter truths of the world, and it made people profoundly uncomfortable. It made him uncomfortable. He was a man who believed in the solid facts of justice, in evidence and reason. But the quiet sorrow in Lila Marin's eyes felt like a fact of its own, a truth that defied easy explanation. He turned his back on the scene, the children's taunts fading as he walked toward his office. The feeling lingered, a cold knot in his gut. It was the same unease he felt when he thought of Mary's death, the chilling realization that a crowd's fear was more powerful than any law he could enforce. It was a wildfire of the soul, and once it started, it burned until there was nothing left but ash. Later that afternoon, the sky began to change. The endless, glaring blue turned to a bruised purple at the edges. The wind, for once, fell silent. An unnatural stillness descended upon Dust Haven, thick and expectant. Then, the first drop of rain fell, striking the dusty street with a small puff. Another followed, and another, until a sudden, torrential downpour was upon them. It was a freak storm, a deluge in the heart of the dry season. Water streamed from rooftops, turned the main street into a muddy river, and washed the grime from the air, leaving behind the clean, sweet scent of wet earth. People stood in the doorways of their shops and homes, their faces turned to the sky in disbelief. In any other place, it would have been a blessing, a welcome respite from the oppressive heat. But in Dust Haven, in the grip of its current anxieties, it was an omen. Eli stood on the covered porch of his office, watching the rain wash over the town. He heard Jebediah, the store owner, speak in a low, fearful tone to a customer. He said, "This is not natural. This is her doing. The curse." The word spread like the rain itself, seeping into the fearful heart of the community. The unseasonal storm was now Lila Marin's storm. The rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and the sun returned, steaming the water from the ground. The world felt scrubbed clean, but the atmosphere in town had grown thicker, more menacing. It was then that Martha, a young mother whose husband worked on the railroad, came running into the street, her face a mask of panic. Her screams were raw, tearing at the strange quiet. "My Sarah," she wailed. "My little Sarah. Has anyone seen my daughter?" A small crowd gathered, their face tight with concern. The child had been playing outside, near the back of their small house, which bordered the very riverbed where Lila Marin lived. The connection was made instantly, silently, in the minds of a dozen people at once. The last place anyone had seen the little girl was near the cursed woman's home. The fear, which had been a low simmer all day, now boiled over. Samuel, the blacksmith, a large man whose opinions were as heavy as his hammer, gave voice to the crowd's terror. He pointed a thick finger toward the river. He said the witch took her. She used this unnatural storm as a cover. His voice, accustomed to ringing over the clang of metal, carried through the street. The crowd, already primed by superstition and the strangeness of the day, needed no further convincing. The word spread from house to house, from the saloon to the church. The child is gone. The witch has her. Eli pushed through the growing mob, his voice a low growl of authority. He told them all to stand down, to give him time to look. He tried to reason with Martha, asking her where she last saw Sarah, what she was wearing. But the mother was inconsolable, her fear stoked by the rising anger of her neighbors. Samuel was whipping them into a frenzy, his words painting a dark picture of spells and sacrifice. "We have to save the child," he roared. "We have to burn the evil out." The suggestion hung in the humid air, terrible and seductive. Eli saw the look in their eyes, the same wild, unreasoning certainty he had seen 10 years ago. They were beyond his reach now, caught in a fever of their own making. A few men ran to their homes and returned with torches, the oil-soaked rags already lit and leaving trails of black smoke in the clean air. They started moving as one, a single organism of fear and rage, their destination clear. They were headed for the riverbed, for the small hut where a lonely woman lived. Eli ran ahead of them, his long legs eating up the muddy ground. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the mob behind him. He was not just running to save Lila Marin. He was running to save the town from itself. He was running from the ghost of his wife, from the ashes of a past that refused to stay buried. He reached the hut moments before the first of the townspeople. Lila stood in the doorway, a small, still figure against the dark interior. Her face was pale, but her eyes were not afraid. They were filled with that same deep, weary sadness he had seen before, a look of grim resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment her entire life. She did not speak. She just watched them come. The mob swelled around the small clearing, their torchlight dancing on the damp ground, their face twisted into masks of righteousness. Samuel stepped forward, his face red with exertion and fury. He yelled for the witch to give them back the child. He said her evil would end tonight. Eli moved to stand between them and the hut, his body a solid line drawn in the mud. He said there would be no more talk of burning. He told them to go home. They hesitated, their momentum broken by his presence. But the anger was still there, a living thing in the flickering light. A rock flew through the air, thudding against the wooden wall of the hut, just beside Lila's head. She did not flinch. That was enough. Eli's hand moved in a blur. The heavy Colt revolver was in his fist, and the sound of its report was a deafening crack that echoed across the riverbed. The shot was aimed at the sky, a single, violent punctuation mark in the evening's madness. The crowd fell silent, their angry shouts dying in their throats. The only sounds were the crackle of the torches and the heavy breathing of frightened men. In the ringing silence, Eli Carter's voice was low, steady, and colder than a winter grave. He looked at Samuel, at Jebediah, at every face he could see in the wavering light. He stated with cold finality that nobody burns anyone in his town. The words hung in the air, an unbreakable promise and an undeniable threat. He stood there, alone against them all, a man of reason in a world gone mad, the torchlight reflected in his hard eyes, and for a moment he looked like a figure from an old tale, a lone lawman standing against the coming darkness. He had saved the accused woman, at least for now. But as he looked from her haunted, sorrowful face to the fearful, angry eyes of the townspeople, he knew the story was only just beginning. The torches sputtered and died one by one as the crowd dissolved, not with a rush, but with a slow, resentful retreat. They left behind a trampled clearing, the smell of burnt oil, and a silence that felt heavier than their shouts had been. Eli did not lower the Colt until the last man, Samuel, had disappeared into the gloom, casting one last look of pure hatred over his shoulder. The night air was cool and damp against Eli's skin. He finally let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding and holstered his weapon. He was acutely aware of the woman standing in the doorway of the hut, a statue carved from shadows. He turned to face her. In the moonlight, her face was a pale oval, her eyes vast and dark. He could not leave her here. The mob was a wounded animal, and it would be back. He said, "You cannot stay here tonight. It is not safe." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and husky, as if from disuse. She said, "There is nowhere else." Eli's jaw tightened. He said, "Yes, there is. Get your things. You are coming with me." She did not move, her gaze searching his face for something he could not name. He saw a flicker of defiance, or perhaps just exhaustion. He softened his tone, but only a little. He told her, "I am not asking. I am the law in this town, and I am placing you in protective custody. Now, please, get what you need." The walk back through Dust Haven was a trial. The street was not empty. Figures watched from darkened porches and behind parted curtains. Doors that had been open were now shut. The silence was absolute, a wall of condemnation that pressed in on them from all sides. Eli walked with his back straight, his gaze fixed ahead, a step on ahead of Lila. He could feel her presence behind him, a small, quiet shadow in the oppressive quiet. He felt every accusing eye on his own back, and for the first time in a long time, he felt utterly alone in the town he was sworn to protect. The sheriff's office was a small, functional building, one half dedicated to his duties, the other containing 2 stark jail cells. A simple cot in the back corner served as his bed. It smelled of leather, gun oil, and stale coffee. He lit a kerosene lamp, and the small room filled with a warm, yellow light that seemed to push back against the hostility of the night. Lila stood just inside the door, clutching a small cloth bundle, her only possession in the world. She looked lost, like a wild bird brought into a cage. Eli gestured toward one of the cells. The door was open. He said, "You can stay in there. It is not much, but the lock is on the outside, and the bars are solid steel. No one will get to you." He saw her flinch at the sight of the cell, and he felt a pang of something he would not call pity. He added, "The door will stay open. You are not my prisoner." She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his directly. There was a question in them, a raw and painful one. She asked why he was doing this. He walked over to the coffee pot that was perpetually on the small stove and found it was still warm. He poured a cup of the black liquid and held it out to her. His own hands felt unsteady. He said, "I am not saying you are innocent, but no one has the right to condemn you but the law, and the law says a person gets a trial, not a mob with torches." She took the cup, her fingers brushing his. They were cold. She did not drink, but held it in both hands as if for warmth. She whispered that the law did not seem to matter much to them. Eli looked out the barred window at the dark street. He knew she was right. He replied, "Maybe not, but it matters to me. It is all I have." The next few days were a lesson in isolation. The town erected an invisible wall around the sheriff's office. When Eli went to the general store for supplies, Jebediah, a man he had known for a decade, suddenly found himself too busy to serve him, his eyes refusing to meet Eli's. The price of coffee and flour, when he was finally able to get them from Jebediah's young son, had mysteriously doubled. Men he used to share a drink with at the saloon now crossed the street to avoid him. Even the children, who once waved at him, now fell silent and stared with wide, fearful eyes as he passed. He was no longer their protector. He was the witch's man. Inside the office, a strange and quiet routine began to form. Lila was a ghost for the first day, staying in the cell, speaking only when spoken to. But on the second morning, Eli woke to find the main office swept clean, his desk neatly organized. A tear in his spare shirt, which had been slung over a chair, was mended with small, perfect stitches. A pot of fresh, strong coffee was brewing on the stove. He looked at her, and she quickly looked away, a faint blush on her cheeks. She said nothing, but the gesture spoke volumes. Slowly, she began to occupy the space. She cooked simple meals for them on the small stove, creating savory stews from the meager supplies he could acquire. The food was better than anything he had eaten in years. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her presence a calming influence in the small, tense space. The wild, haunted look in her eyes began to soften, replaced by a deep and profound gratitude that she expressed not in words, but in these small, domestic acts of care. He found himself watching her as she worked, the way her hands moved as she kneaded dough for biscuits, the intense focus in her eyes as she sewed. He was a man starved for softness in a hard world, and her quiet presence was like a gentle rain on parched ground. One night, he was jolted from a light sleep by a sound from the cell. It was a small, choked cry. He sat up on his cot, his hand instinctively going to the gun he kept beside him. He listened, and the sound came again. It was Lila, caught in a nightmare. She was murmuring, her words tangled with fear. "Curse," she whispered. "Oh, Mama, the curse!" He got up and walked quietly to the cell door. She was thrashing on the narrow bunk, her face contorted in a dream of some past terror. Her voice grew clearer, her words slicing through the darkness of the office and into his heart. She said, Whoever loves you will die. You told me, everyone, they all die. He stood there in the darkness, a cold dread washing over him. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to step back, to put distance between himself and the sleeping woman and her terrible, whispered prophecy. This was the superstition he fought against, the very poison that was turning his town against him. Yet, hearing those words from her own lips, words that spoke of a belief planted deep within her own soul, he felt a sliver of ice in his veins. He was a man who prided himself on his reason, but his heart, a thing he had long thought dormant, felt a profound and aching sympathy for her. He saw not a witch, but a woman so thoroughly convinced of her own blighted nature that she dreamed of it. He felt a fierce, protective anger toward whatever, or whoever, had done this to her, and beneath that, a flicker of fear. What if he was wrong? What if he was bringing the very disaster he was trying to prevent into his own life? The next day, the pressure from the town intensified. Reed, the owner of the largest cattle ranch in the territory, rode into town. He was a big man with a florid face and eyes as small and hard as pebbles. He held sway over half the men in Dust Haven, who depended on his ranch for work. Reed saw Eli's principled stand not as an act of justice, but as a weakness, a challenge to the established order of things. He dismounted in front of the saloon and began to preach to the men who gathered there. Eli watched from his window as Reed worked the crowd. He could not hear the words, but he could see their effect. Reed gestured toward the sheriff's office, his face a mask of scorn and outrage. The men around him grew agitated, their postures more aggressive. A runner was sent, a young ranch hand who delivered the message with a nervous, defiant look. He said Reed wanted to see him. He said the men were talking, saying the sheriff has lost his mind, that he is protecting that demon while a child is still missing. Eli sent the boy away with a simple message that he was busy. He knew it was a temporary reprieve. He was caught now, trapped between his sworn duty to the law and the rising tide of folk belief, a faith far older and more powerful than any statute book. He was standing between two fires, and he could feel the heat from both. That evening, as he was cleaning his rifle, Lila approached him. She had her small bundle in her hands again. Her face was set, her eyes filled with a terrible resolve. She told him, "I have to go. This is my fault. I am putting you in danger." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes. Fear not for herself, but for him. She truly believed she was a source of calamity. She believed that by helping her, he had somehow invited her curse upon himself. He said quietly, "Where would you go?" She gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the vast, empty plains beyond. She said, "Away. Somewhere no one can be hurt because of me. It is better this way." He stood up, his full height seeming to fill the small room. He walked over and gently took the bundle from her hands, placing it on the table. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He could let her go. It would be the easy thing to do. The town would calm down. His life would return to its solitary, predictable rhythm. But the thought of her, alone out there, prey to the harshness of the land and the cruelty of men, was something he could not abide. More than that, it would mean that fear had won. It would mean that the mob had defeated the law. It would mean that Mary's death had taught him nothing. He met her gaze, his own eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. A conviction settled in his soul, solid and heavy as iron. "They say you are cursed," he said, his voice low and rough. "Maybe I am cursed too, but I will be damned if I let fear run this town." His words hung between them, a declaration that changed the very air in the small office. It was no longer just a sanctuary for her. It had become a fortress for them both. Lila looked at him, and for the first time, the deep sadness in her eyes was mingled with a fragile, burgeoning hope. She did not try to leave again. She stayed, and the quiet rhythm of their shared existence deepened, a silent pact made against the hostile world outside their door. The opportunity to test that pact came 3 days later. A boy, the son of the town tanner, was struck down with a raging fever. The boy's breathing was shallow and ragged, his skin burning to the touch. The town's only physician, a man more skilled in whiskey than in medicine, had been gone for a week to a conference in a larger city, leaving the boy's mother, a young woman named Anne, in a state of frantic despair. Eli heard the news from the deputy he paid to run errands, a young man too simple to be swayed by the town's politics. The boy was not expected to last the night. That evening, Lila approached Eli, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. She spoke in a low, urgent voice. She said, "I have seen this fever before. There are herbs by the river, willow bark and yarrow. They can break the fever. If I can prepare a poultice and a tea." Eli looked at her, seeing not a witch but a healer, her knowledge a buried treasure the town was too blind to see. He knew the risk. If the boy died, they would not say the fever took him. They would say she had killed him with her sorcery. But if he lived, he asked her, "Are you certain?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. I cannot promise a miracle, Sheriff, but I can promise a chance." He made his decision in an instant. He told her to write down what she needed, under the cover of a moonless sky. He slipped out of the office and made his way to the riverbank, the place the town now shunned. He moved like a shadow, gathering the plants she had described, his fingers tracing the shapes of leaves in the dark. He returned with a small sack of herbs, and Lila set to work immediately, her movements precise and confident. She crushed leaves, steeped bark, her hands working with a practiced skill that spoke of long experience. She prepared a small bundle and a flask of dark, fragrant tea. He took the medicine from her, their hands brushing for a second time. This time, she did not pull away. She just looked at him, her eyes wide with a silent plea. "Do not let them know it was from me," she whispered. Eli found the tanner's small house shrouded in a fearful quiet. He knocked, and when Anne opened the door, her face stained with tears, he did not enter. He simply held out the bundle and the flask. He said, "A friend of mine from another town sent this. He is skilled with remedies. He told me it might help the boy. It can do no harm." The woman hesitated, her eyes filled with suspicion. But the sound of her son's labored breathing from inside the house was a more powerful argument than any fear. She took the medicine, her hand trembling. "Thank you, Sheriff," she mumbled, and closed the door. Eli walked away, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had not lied, but he had not told the truth. He had gambled with a boy's life and a woman's reputation, and he did not know if he had done the right thing. The boy lived. By morning, his fever had broken. Within 2 days, he was sitting up in bed, weak but recovering. The news traveled through Dust Haven, but it was not the news Eli had hoped for. Anne, in her gratitude and fear, had told her neighbors the sheriff had brought her a miracle cure. The story became twisted in the telling. It was not a friend's remedy. It was the witch's magic. The town buzzed with a new kind of rumor. She had not cursed the boy, but she had used her dark powers to save him. They whispered that such magic always came with a price. What had she demanded in return? What new evil would befall them now that she had shown she could command life as well as death? The miracle had only deepened their fear, turning it from simple hatred into a kind of terrified awe. While the town was consumed with Lila, Eli turned his attention to the real poison seeping into Dust Haven. He had long been suspicious of Reed, the cattle baron whose influence was like a shadow over the town. Reed's ranch hands were rowdier than most, and there was a current of violence that seemed to flow from the man himself, taking advantage of the town's distraction. Eli began to watch him. He spent his nights not in his office, but in the hills overlooking Reed's sprawling property. On the third night of his vigil, he saw it, a wagon, moving without lanterns, met another on a deserted stretch of road. Barrels were exchanged. Eli moved closer, staying downwind, and the sharp, unmistakable smell of untaxed whiskey reached him. Reed was running liquor, a profitable and dangerous game that brought drifters and outlaws into his orbit. But it was more than that. The next day, Eli visited the county records office in the next town over. He discovered that Reed had been systematically buying up the debt on smaller homesteads, using strong-arm tactics and the flow of his illegal money to choke out his neighbors. The chaos surrounding Lila was the perfect cover, a smokescreen for his quiet, ruthless conquest of the valley. The following afternoon, Eli rode out to Reed's ranch. He found the man overseeing the branding of new calves, the air thick with the smell of burnt hair and hide. Reed greeted him with a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He offered Eli a drink, which the sheriff declined. Eli got straight to the point. He said, "I know about the whiskey. Reed, I know about the land deeds." Reed's smile vanished. He picked up a branding iron from the fire, its end glowing a malevolent orange. He looked at the searing metal, then at Eli. He said, "You are a fool. Carter, you should have spent your time worrying about that witch you are keeping instead of my business." Eli's hand rested on the butt of his Colt. He said, "Lila Marin has nothing to do with this." Reed laughed. A short, ugly sound. He said, "She has everything to do with it. She is a curse on this land, and you, by protecting her, you have brought that curse on yourself." He took a step closer, the heat from the iron washing over Eli's face. He lowered his voice to a menacing growl. He said, "You protect that woman. You will end up dead, just like her husband did." The words struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. Husband. The thought had never even occurred to him. He kept his face a mask of stone, betraying nothing. He simply said, "This is your only warning. Reed, shut down your operation." He turned and walked away, Reed's laughter following him across the dusty yard. The threat was clear, but the mystery was deeper. Lila had been married, and her husband was dead. It was another piece of her story, another tragedy that defined her. When he returned to the office, he found Lila humming quietly to herself as she swept the floor. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air around her. She looked up as he entered, and she gave him a small, hesitant smile. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. Not a sad twist of the lips, but a genuine expression of simple contentment. It transformed her face. The weary sadness was gone, replaced by a light that seemed to shine from within. It was as soft and gentle as the sunlight filtering through the window, and it struck him with a surprising force. He saw, in that fleeting moment, not the cursed witch or the tragic victim, but the woman she might have been, the woman she still could be. He was so taken aback that he almost forgot Reed's threat. The next day, the heat was stifling. The small well behind the office was their only source of fresh water, and the bucket seemed heavier than usual. Eli was hauling it up, his muscles straining. When Lila came out to help him, she placed her hands on the rope beside his to help pull. As they drew the bucket over the edge of the well, their hands touched. It was a brief, accidental contact, skin against skin. A current, warm and startling, passed between them. She gasped and pulled her hand back as if she had been burned, her eyes wide with alarm. It was the ingrained reaction of someone who believed her very touch was poison. But her gaze met his, and for a long moment, they just stood there, the world shrinking to the space between them. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the shared danger, the quiet intimacy of their confinement, and a new, fragile awareness that neither of them was ready to name. That evening, the silence in the office was different. It was not empty, but full of the memory of that moment at the well. Finally, Lila spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She asked if he had ever wondered about her past, before Dust Haven. Eli turned to face her. He said, "I have—" He waited, letting her decide what she would share. She took a deep breath, and the story came pouring out of her, a river of grief held back for too long. She had been married to a good man, a doctor named Andrew. They had gone to a new mining camp in the mountains, full of hope. He was to be the camp doctor, And she, with her knowledge of nursing, was to be his assistant. For a time, it was good. But then a sickness came, a fever that moved through the camp like a wildfire. They had worked day and night, Andrew and she, trying to save people, but the fever was too strong. One by one, their patients died. Then Andrew himself grew sick. He died in her arms. She was one of only a handful of survivors. The others, crazed with grief and fear, needed someone to blame. They looked at her, the woman who had tended to all the dying, the woman who had miraculously survived. And they called her a curse. They said she had brought death to them. They chased her from the camp with stones and threats, and she had been running ever since. And as he listened, Eli's heart ached for her. The pieces all fell into place, the sadness in her eyes, her knowledge of herbs, her fear of her own touch. She was not cursed. She was a survivor, a healer who had been profoundly and cruelly misunderstood. Her only crime was that she had not died with everyone else. A new feeling began to awaken in his chest. It was not the simple desire a man feels for a woman. It was a deep, powerful current of compassion, mixed with an overwhelming respect for her resilience. She had endured more than anyone he had ever known and had not been broken by it. She had held on to a core of gentleness and decency in a world that had shown her nothing but brutality. He looked out the window, past the sleeping town to the dry riverbed. In the pale moonlight, he could see that the water line had receded even further. The small pools that remained looked stagnant and shallow. It seemed to him that the river was a mirror for the town itself, its reserves of kindness and reason drying up under the relentless heat of fear. And in that moment, he knew he would not let that fear win. He would not let it claim her, and he would not let it claim him. The revelation of Lila's past settled between them, a shared truth that deepened their alliance into a fragile, unspoken bond. For several days, an uneasy peace held. The town watched them with simmering resentment, but the absence of a new disaster gave them no fuel for their fire. Inside the sheriff's office, Eli and Lila moved around each other with a new, quiet awareness. The air was charged with things unsaid, with the memory of her story and his steadfast protection. He found himself looking for reasons to be near her, and she no longer flinched from his presence. The fear that had ruled her for so long was beginning to recede, replaced by a tentative trust that was as beautiful and as delicate as a desert flower after a rare rain. The peace was shattered on a suffocatingly hot evening. The sun had set, but the heat lingered, trapped between the baked earth and the starless sky. A scent, sharper and more acrid than the usual smells of dust and cattle, drifted on the still air. Smoke. At first, it was a faint whisper, but it grew quickly into a choking pall. Then the town bell began to ring, not with its steady Sunday summons, but with a frantic, clanging alarm that spoke of catastrophe. Eli threw open the office door. Against the blackness of the night, a monstrous orange glow pulsed, illuminating the town in a terrifying, flickering light. The grain warehouse, the town's largest building and its most vital resource, was ablaze. Flames licked up the dry timber walls and roared through the open loading doors, a hungry beast consuming the town's future. People were pouring into the street, their faces aghast in the firelight, their shouts a chaotic chorus of fear and disbelief. Eli grabbed his gun belt, his mind racing. It was the driest part of the season. A stray spark could have done this, but he knew, with a sinking certainty, that the town would not see it that way. He turned to Lila. She was standing by the window, her face a pale mask of horror. He said, "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The old fear was back, colder and more intense than ever. She whispered, "They will blame me." He gripped her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. He said, "I will not let them. Just stay here." He ran toward the fire, joining the desperate, disorganized bucket brigade. But his efforts were lost in the roar of the crowd's newfound certainty. Reed was there, his face flushed with excitement rather than exertion. He was not fighting the fire. He was stoking a different kind of blaze. He pointed a long arm, not at the warehouse, but at the sheriff's office, a lone building away from the chaos. He bellowed over the roar of the flames. "This is her work, the witch! She has cursed our harvest. She has brought the devil's fire upon us." The accusation, shouted into the heart of their terror, was all the proof the mob needed. Their fear of starvation was now greater than their fear of the sheriff. Their focus shifted instantly from the burning building to the woman they held responsible. The bucket brigade dissolved as men turned, their faces grim, their intent clear. They began to move, a human wave of fury, toward the sheriff's office. Eli saw the shift and his blood ran cold. He ran to intercept them, planting himself on the steps of his office, his arms spread wide. He yelled for them to stop, that they were being fools. But his voice was a single drop of reason in an ocean of rage. Reed pushed his way to the front, a triumphant sneer on his face. He said, "Get out of the way. Carter, we are here for the witch. Justice has to be done." Eli drew his revolver, the click of the hammer cocking loud in a momentary lull. He said, "The only justice in this town comes from me. Go back to the fire. That is the real enemy." A man beside Reed lunged forward. Eli fired a warning shot into the air, the blast echoing off the buildings. The crowd faltered, but only for a second. Reed, seeing his chance, shouted, "He is protecting her. He is one of them. He will let the whole town burn to save his witch." It was the spark that ignited the final explosion. They surged forward. Eli was a strong man, but he was 1 against 20. A heavy fist caught him on the side of the head, making the fiery world spin. He staggered, trying to raise his pistol, but someone kicked it from his hand. He saw Reed's face in front of him, contorted with hate, and then the blows began to rain down. Fists and boots. He felt a sharp crack as a rib gave way, a searing pain in his shoulder. He fought back, a desperate, cornered animal, but he was being overwhelmed, drowned in their violence. He fell to his knees, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth. Through a haze of pain, he saw them smashing down the office door. Inside, Lila had heard the gunshot, had heard the splintering of wood. She knew Eli was being overcome. Her first instinct was to hide, to retreat to the cell as she had been told, but then she heard his groan of pain, a sound that cut through her fear. She thought of his kindness, of his unwavering belief in her when no one else had. She thought of the forehead kiss that promised not passion, but sanctuary. And she knew she could not let him die for her. She scrambled out the small, barred window at the back of the office, a feat of desperate agility. The chaos was her cover. The mob was inside, ransacking the office, looking for her. The rest of the town was still distracted by the fire. She crept around the side of the building and saw him. He was lying on the ground, a crumpled form in the dirt, barely conscious. The mob, not finding her inside, was spilling back out, their rage growing. They would kill him. Her fear gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She grabbed him under the arms, her voice a fierce whisper in his ear. "Sheriff, Eli, we have to go." She pulled, dragging his dead weight away from the light, into the shadows between the buildings. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she did not stop. She used the noise and confusion, the deep shadows cast by the fire, to move them away from the center of town, away from the hunt. Their sanctuary was the old church at the edge of Dust Haven, abandoned for years after a new one was built. Its steeple was crumbling, its windows boarded up. She managed to pry open the heavy, creaking doors and haul him inside, collapsing with him on the dusty floor just as the heavens opened. The rain that had been threatening all day finally came. A sudden, violent downpour that hammered on the church roof and hissed against the distant fire. She was safe, for the moment. She found an old box of candles near the ruined altar and managed to light one, its small flame pushing back the immense darkness of the church. In the flickering light, She examined his injuries. His face was a mass of cuts and bruises, his breathing shallow and pained. She tore strips from her own petticoat, her hands gentle and sure, and cleaned his wounds with rainwater she collected in a broken font. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering her name. He finally came to, his eyes focusing on her face, haloed by the candlelight. He tried to sit up, but fell back with a gasp of pain. He looked around at the decaying splendor of the church, at the rain streaming down the inside of a broken window pane. He asked, "Where are we?" She told him, "In the old church." "You were hurt. I had to get you away." He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. His fingers were rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He looked at her, his gaze clear and filled with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. All the pain, all the confusion seemed to fall away from him, leaving only a core of absolute certainty. "They call you cursed," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. He took a ragged breath. "But you are the blessing I have prayed for." The words were a key, unlocking a place in her heart that had been sealed shut for years. It was not a declaration of love as she had once known it, not a promise of romance. It was something deeper, a recognition of her soul, a validation of her very existence. He saw not the witch, not the harbinger of death, but the healer, the survivor, the good woman she had always been. He drew himself up with a great effort, ignoring the pain it cost him, and leaned forward. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss that was a vow, a benediction, an apology for all the cruelty the world had shown her. It was the most profound act of tenderness she had ever known. A single tear escaped her eye, then another, and then she was weeping. The silent, wrenching sobs of a soul unburdened. They were not tears of fear or sorrow, they were tears of gratitude, of relief, of the overwhelming, earth-shattering discovery that she was not alone. After all the years of running, of being reviled and feared, she was finally, truly, seen. Outside, the storm raged, the rain washing the smoke from the air. But another storm was gathering. The wind howled through the cracks in the old church walls, a mournful, menacing sound like a whispered threat. Reed and his men would not be stopped by a fire or a downpour. They were out there, somewhere in the night, hunting. The truth of the fire, the truth of Reed's villainy, was still buried in the darkness. And Lila knew, as she held the sheriff's hand in the candlelight, that the dawn would bring a new and more terrible reckoning. The first light of dawn filtered through the grime of the church's broken windows, casting long, dusty rays across the pews. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnervingly quiet. Eli was propped against the altar, the initial fire of his pain settling into a deep, throbbing ache in his ribs and shoulder. Lila had done what she could, her touch gentle, her efficiency a quiet marvel. She had found a small, overlooked tin of well water kept by the old sacristy and used it to clean his wounds. Now, she sat beside him, her exhaustion a visible weight on her small frame. The single candle flame flickered, a tiny star in the cavernous dark. His promise, his blessing, still hung in the air between them, a truth more solid than the stone walls around them. But truth was not enough. They were fugitives in their own town, and Reed was not a man to give up a hunt. Eli knew they could not stay here. He needed evidence, something more concrete than his own word against a man who held the town in his fist. He looked at the first gray hints of morning and knew he had to move. He pushed himself to a sitting position, a groan escaping his lips despite his best efforts to suppress it. Lila was instantly at his side, her hand on his arm. "You cannot move," she said, her voice laced with a new and unfamiliar note of command. "You are hurt badly." He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, and his resolve hardened. He told her, "If we stay here, we die. If we run, we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. There is only one way this ends. I have to prove what Reed is." He laid out his plan in a low whisper. He would go to the warehouse first, what was left of it. Then he would pay a visit to Reverend Michael, the old preacher who had retired to a small cottage when the new church was built. The man was weak, easily swayed, but Eli suspected his conscience was a heavy burden. Lila was to stay hidden, to barricade the door and wait for his return. She argued, her fear for him overriding her own, but he was immovable. He gave her the small derringer he kept in his boot, pressing it into her hand. He said, "Only for the worst. You wait for me." Moving through the dawn-lit streets was a painful, slow process. Every step sent a jolt of fire through his side. He kept to the alleyways, a shadow in his own town. The air smelled of wet ash and ruin. The warehouse was a blackened skeleton, still smoking in the damp air. The townspeople were gone, retreated to their homes to nurse their shame or their self-righteousness. Eli circled the wreckage, his eyes scanning the muddy ground, and then he found it, tucked under the edge of a collapsed wall, as if kicked there in haste, a tin of kerosene, nearly empty. It was not the brand sold at the general store. It was a specialty item, one he had seen stacked in the supplies shed on Reed's ranch. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a beginning. His next stop was the old preacher's cottage. Reverend Michael answered the door, looking as if he had not slept in a year. His eyes were haunted. Eli did not have to press him hard. The sight of the sheriff, battered and bruised but still standing, seemed to break the last of the old man's resolve. He collapsed into a chair and the confession spilled out of him, a torrent of guilty words. "It was Reed," the preacher whispered, his hands trembling. "He started the rumors after those first men died. So suddenly, Reed saw how frightened people were, and he fed that fear. He told me to speak of curses from the pulpit, of dark signs. He said the woman was an agent of evil, sent to test our faith. He paid me. I was weak. I took his money." Eli leaned against the doorframe, his own weakness making the room swim. He asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why did Reed want her gone so badly? The preacher wrung his hands. He said he did not know for sure, but Reed was terrified of her. He said she lived too close to the river, that she saw too much. He mentioned the night the trapper died, the one found in his sleep. Reed had been furious, saying the man had been a business partner, that he was supposed to meet him that very night by the riverbed. Reed was convinced Lila had seen something, that she was a witness to some secret. The pieces clicked into place in Eli's mind. The whiskey was a front, the late-night meetings by the river, the secret partners. Reed was trafficking something far more sinister. He remembered seeing small, carefully wrapped parcels being unloaded from those wagons. Not just barrels, opium, a poison that rotted a man from the inside out, a trade that would bring the darkest sort of men to Dust Haven. Lila, in her innocent isolation, had been living on the doorstep of his entire operation. She was not a curse, she was a threat. He thanked the preacher and left him to his conscience. As he slipped back into the alleyway, a movement caught his eye, a small figure huddled in the shadows across the street. Lila. She had not obeyed him. She had followed, unable to bear waiting in the lonely darkness of the church. Her face was a mask of anguish. She had heard it all. She had heard that she was the reason for the fire, for his beating, for the entire town's descent into madness. Before he could go to her, she turned and ran, not back toward the church, but in the opposite direction, toward the main road that led out of town. He knew instantly where she was going. She was going to Reed. She was going to turn herself in, to offer herself up as a sacrifice, believing it was the only way to save him from further trouble. A rage unlike anything he had ever known surged through Eli, a white-hot fury that burned away his pain and exhaustion. He forgot his injuries. He forgot caution. He ran, his boots pounding on the muddy ground, his only thought to get to her before Reed did. The sky was changing again. The clear, post-rain air was gone, replaced by a hazy yellow light. The wind was picking up, not the familiar devil's breath, but a stronger, more violent force that carried a sting of sand with it, A dust storm was coming. He found her on the road to Reed's ranch, a small, determined figure walking into the heart of the danger. He caught up to her, grabbing her arm. She struggled, tears streaming down her dusty face. She cried, "Let me go. It is my fault. I am the curse. I have to end it." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his bruised chest. He said, "No, you are not the curse. He is, and I am the one who is going to end it." He told her to go back to the church, to lock herself in, and this time he saw in her eyes that she would obey. He watched until she was out of sight, then turned toward the ranch. The wind was a solid wall now, visibility dropping to a few yards. The world had become a swirling vortex of sand and fury. He found Reed near a high bluff overlooking a rocky ravine, trying to secure his cattle against the coming storm. The rancher turned as Eli approached, a look of surprise followed by a cruel smile. He said, "I knew you were not dead. Come to beg for your witch's life. She came here, offered herself to me. I sent her away. I do not want her. I want you." They came together without another word. It was not a fight. It was a collision. Reed was bigger, his body hardened by years of ranch work. Eli was fueled by a pure, righteous anger that gave him a strength he did not know he had. They grappled in the blinding dust, their world reduced to the feel of straining muscle and the sting of sand in their eyes. A fist connected with Eli's already broken ribs, and he cried out, a sound that was stolen by the wind. Reed pressed his advantage, his thumbs finding Eli's throat. Eli, choking, his vision turning black at the edges, thrashed wildly. His hand found a loose rock on the ground. He brought it up with all his remaining strength and smashed it against the side of Reed's head. The big man grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was enough. Eli broke free, gasping for air. They circled each other, two ghosts in the storm. Reed, blood trickling from his temple, lunged again. He was blind with rage, his arrogance his only guide. He swung a haymaker of a punch, putting all his weight behind it. Eli ducked under the blow, and Reed, his momentum unchecked, stumbled forward. His foot found no purchase on the loose shale at the edge of the bluff. He teetered there for a moment, his arms windmilling against the storm, his eyes wide with a sudden, stark terror. He looked at Eli, a silent appeal for a hand he had not earned. Eli just watched. From the edge of the storm, a few of Reed's ranch hands and a handful of townspeople who had followed the sheriff stared, paralyzed by the spectacle. No one moved. No one offered a hand. Reed cried out, a thin, desperate sound, and then he was gone, swallowed by the ravine and the storm. The wind howled, already beginning the work of burying him, of erasing him from the land he had tried to poison. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, and then leaving behind a world scoured and silent. The townspeople looked at Eli, then at the ravine, then at their own hands. The truth was laid bare before them, ugly and undeniable. They had been played for fools, their fears weaponized against them. They had nearly murdered an innocent woman and the only man who stood for what was right. Their guilt was a palpable thing, a silence more damning than any accusation. They turned and walked back to town, not as a mob, but as a scattered collection of shamed individuals. Eli's rage was spent, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness and a pain that was now almost unbearable. His only thought was of Lila. He found her back at the church, collapsed just inside the door. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow. The smoke from the fire, the terror, the emotional and physical toll of the last few days had caught up to her. A fever was consuming her. He lifted her into his arms. She was light, fragile as a bird. He did not take her to the sheriff's office. He carried her through the silent, watching town, to his own small house, the house he had once shared with Mary. He laid her in his own bed and began the slow, patient work of caring for her. He bathed her forehead with cool water, forced sips of broth between her lips, and sat by her side, watching, waiting. As he sat vigil through the night, he heard a new sound, a gentle, rhythmic tapping against the window pane. He looked outside. Soft, steady rain was falling. It was not a violent deluge or a dusty squall. It was a true, life-giving rain, the first in 3 long months of drought. It fell on the scorched earth, on the ashes of the warehouse, on the roof of the house where 2 broken souls had found each other. It was washing the dust and the blood and the sin away, offering the parched land and the people on it the chance to begin again. The fever burned in Lila for 2 days and 2 nights, a purifying fire that consumed the last vestiges of her fear. Eli, in turn, fought his own battle with the deep, relentless pain in his body. His world shrank to the 4 walls of his small house, a place that had been a monument to his loneliness but was now a sanctuary for 2. The rhythms of their recovery became a silent language between them. He would wake from a fitful sleep to find a cool cloth on his forehead, placed there by her trembling hand. She would stir from her delirium to find him sitting in the chair beside the bed, a shotgun across his lap, his unwavering presence a bulwark against the ghosts that haunted her sleep. He was the patient, but she was the one who needed healing most. As her fever receded, leaving her weak but lucid, she took over his care with a quiet determination. Her knowledge of herbs, once a source of suspicion, was now their salvation. She made poultices for his bruises from comfrey and arnica she found in the small garden behind the house, her touch light and professional. She brewed willow bark tea for his pain and made thin, nourishing broths that slowly coaxed his strength back. He watched her, his own aches and pains, a distant hum beneath the profound sense of peace that filled the small house. He had lived in silence for a decade, the silence of grief. This was a different kind of quiet, a silence filled with unspoken understanding, with the soft sounds of her movements and the steady beat of 2 hearts that had, against all odds, found a matching rhythm. In the evenings, when the light grew soft, she would read to him. She found the old family Bible on a dusty shelf, its leather cover worn smooth by his mother's hands. Her voice was low and clear, and the ancient words of Psalms and Proverbs filled the room not with piety, but with a simple, profound comfort. He was not a religious man, but he found himself listening to the cadence of her voice more than the words themselves. It was a sound that soothed the ragged edges of his soul, a sound he realized he had been waiting a lifetime to hear. He watched the lamplight play on her face as she read, illuminating the gentle curve of her cheek and the deep, thoughtful concentration in her eyes. He had faced down a mob for her, fought a man to the death for her. But it was in these quiet moments that he understood the true depth of his feelings. It was a love born not in fire and passion, but in the shared ashes of their former lives. The town, meanwhile, was wrestling with its own sickness, an ailment of the soul. The truth about Reed, about the fire, about their own blind fear, had settled over Dust Haven like a shroud. The first sign of a change came on the 4th day. A knock at the door, soft and hesitant. Eli, leaning heavily on a cane he had fashioned from a broken chair leg, opened it to find Anne, the tanner's wife, standing on his porch. In her hands, she held a loaf of freshly baked bread and a small crock of butter. She would not meet his eyes. She looked at the floorboards and mumbled that she had heard the sheriff was unwell. She asked after Lila. Her voice was thick with shame. Lila came to stand behind Eli, a shadow in the doorway. Anne looked up then, and her eyes, when they met Lila's, were filled with a desperate, painful appeal. She said, "My boy, Thomas, his cough has returned. I know it was you. The medicine. Could you—" She could not finish. The request was a confession, an apology, and a plea all in one. Lila looked at the woman, and Eli could see the war within her. The healer's instinct wrestled with the survivor's terror. She took a half-step back, the old fear of her curse a physical thing that made her flinch. What if the boy grew worse? What if something happened, and this fragile truce with the town shattered? And they came for her again. She looked at Eli. her eyes wide with uncertainty. He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Her skin was cool against his. He looked from her face to Anne's and then back again. He said, his voice quiet but firm, "If you can heal me, you can heal them too." His words were not just an encouragement, they were a statement of absolute faith. He was not asking her to try. He was telling her what he knew to be true. He was lending her his own certainty until hers was strong enough to stand on its own. She looked down at their joined hands, then back at the desperate mother on the porch. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, and she gave a single, decisive nod. She told Anne what herbs to gather, her voice gaining strength with each word. That single act of forgiveness, of trust, broke the dam. The next day, it was Jebediah from the general store, his face a mask of misery, asking for something for the ache in his joints. Then it was Samuel, the blacksmith, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat, admitting his wife had been suffering from terrible headaches. They came not as a mob, but as individuals. Their requests for remedies a veiled plea for absolution. Lila helped them all. She did so with a quiet grace, never mentioning the torches or the hateful words. She dispensed her knowledge as she had always wanted to, not as a witch performing magic, but as a woman helping her neighbors. With each person she helped, a layer of the curse they had wrapped around her fell away, and she began to see herself as they were beginning to see her a healer. One afternoon, when the sun was warm and the air smelled of rain-washed earth, Lila walked to the small well behind the house. She had been washing Eli's bloody clothes from the fight, her hands stained and raw. She drew a fresh bucket of cold, clear water and plunged her hands into it. She watched as the pink clouds of diluted blood dissipated, washed away by the clean water. She scrubbed her hands, her fingers, her palms, a slow, deliberate ritual. She remembered her husband, Andrew, and the dozens of miners she had tended as they died, their blood on her hands. She thought of the years she had spent believing those stains were a permanent part of her, a mark of her curse. But as she lifted her hands from the bucket, they were clean. The water was still clear. In the bright afternoon sun, she saw only her own skin, pale and unmarked. It was a baptism, a release. She was still standing there, staring at her hands, when a small sound made her look up. It was Sarah, the little girl whose disappearance had been the catalyst for the whole nightmare. The child had been found the day after the storm, fast asleep in a neighbor's hayloft, having wandered off to chase a kitten. Now, she stood a few feet away, her eyes wide. In her small, outstretched hand, she held a fistful of wildflowers, their colors a vibrant splash against the muted tones of the day. She took a tentative step forward and held them out to Lila. "For you," she said in a tiny voice. Lila knelt, her knees weak with emotion. She took the flowers, her fingers brushing the child's. The little girl did not pull away. She smiled, a bright, innocent, gap-toothed smile that held no memory of fear, only the simple, beautiful truth of a gift freely given. Lila felt a tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. The town had finally, truly, forgiven her. More importantly, she had finally forgiven herself. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the plains, Eli sat at the small table in his kitchen. He was cleaning his colt, the motions familiar and comforting. Lila was humming softly as she prepared their simple supper. He finished his work, assembled the weapon, and laid it on the table. Next to it, he placed his sheriff's badge, the silver star gleaming in the lamplight. He looked at the two objects, the tools of his trade, the symbols of his identity. They looked foreign to him now, relics from another life. He looked at Lila, her presence a warm and steady light in his home. He said, "I spent my whole life believing in this." He tapped the badge, believing that the law was the only thing that could hold the darkness back. But I was wrong. The law cannot heal a wounded heart. It cannot mend a broken spirit. He pushed the badge away slightly. But trust can, he said, his eyes meeting hers. Trust can. They ate their meal in comfortable silence and then went out onto the porch to watch the last of the day fade. The night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant in the clean air. They did not speak for a long time, simply sharing the immense, peaceful quiet of the prairie. They stayed there until the first hint of gray appeared on the eastern horizon, and they watched as the sun rose, spilling brilliant color across the land. The world, which had been a place of dust and shadow and fear, was reborn in light, vibrant and full of promise. Lila drew a deep breath, the air cool and sweet in her lungs. She turned to him, her face bathed in the golden light of the new day. "Maybe I am not cursed after all," she said, her voice soft with wonder. Eli looked at her, at the woman who had dragged him from the fire, who had nursed him back to health, who had healed his town and his heart. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes for the first time in a decade. "Maybe," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "maybe I was the one who was cursed. Until I met you." The weeks that followed the storm were a time of quiet mending, both for the land and for the people who lived on it. The gentle rain had coaxed a surprising blush of green from the scorched earth, and in the same way, the town of Dust Haven began to show signs of new life. The shame of their actions had been a harsh medicine, but it seemed to be working a cure. People began to speak to one another again, their voices softer, their eyes less quick to judge. The story of Reed's treachery in the sheriff's stand had become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered over fence posts and saloon tables. And at the center of that tale were the two figures in the small house at the edge of town, the sheriff and the woman they no longer called a witch. For Eli and Lila, the world had shrunk to the size of his property, and within that small space, they found a universe. He recovered his strength slowly, the deep ache in his bones a constant reminder of how close he had come to the edge. Lila was his shadow, his nurse, his companion. She moved through his house with a quiet purpose that transformed it. The lingering scent of stale grief that had clung to the walls for a decade was replaced by the aroma of baking bread and drying herbs. His life, which had been a stark landscape of duty and memory, was suddenly filled with the soft colors of her presence. Yet, as his body healed, his soul began to ache with a new and unfamiliar pain. The ghost he had lived with for 10 years, the memory of his wife, Mary, began to stir. He would watch Lila sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth, the very chair Mary had loved, and a cold fist would clench in his gut. He would hear Lila's soft humming as she worked in the garden and mistake it for a moment for Mary's, and the guilt would wash over him, a suffocating tide. He had failed Mary. He had been unable to save her from the fire, from the town's blind fear. He remembered the night of the fire with a clarity that time had not dimmed the smell of burning hay, the terrifying speed of the flames, the sound of her screams swallowed by the roar. He remembered his own desperate helplessness, a man with a gun and a badge rendered useless by a locked door and a wall of flame. He had honored her memory with a stoic, unbreachable loneliness. It had been his penance. Now, this new feeling for Lila, this gentle, powerful love that had taken root in the ruins of his life, felt like a betrayal. It felt as if he were finally letting Mary die, letting her memory turn to ash just as her body had. He would look at Lila, at her kind eyes and her resilient spirit, and his heart would be torn in two. One half reached for her, for the future she represented, while the other clung desperately to the past, to the ghost he felt he had a duty to protect. Lila, too, was fighting her own ghosts, though the town treated her with a new, almost reverent respect. She could not shed the skin of the outcast so easily. The years of being reviled had left their mark. She would walk to the general store and feel the silence that fell as she entered, a silence that was no longer hostile, but was still a silence, a separation, and she began to hear the whispers. They were different now, tinged with awe instead of hatred, but they were whispers all the same. She heard Jebediah's wife talking to a neighbor, her voice low. She said it was a miracle how the sheriff had recovered. She said it was as if he had been bewitched, made strong again by that woman's strange arts. The word struck Lila like a physical blow. Bewitched. They still did not see her. They had simply replaced one form of magic with another. They saw her not as a healer, but as an enchantress who had cast a spell over their sheriff. She began to notice the way the women of the town looked at Eli when he was near her. A look of pity and concern. Poor sheriff. Their eyes seemed to say, trapped by a power he does not understand. Her old fear, the deep-seated belief that she was a source of ruin, came creeping back. She had not brought disaster to Eli in the form of a snake bite or a broken neck, but she was bringing it all the same. She was poisoning his reputation, turning him into a figure of spectacle and suspicion. He was a man of the law, a man whose authority depended on the respect of his community. If they saw him as a bewitched fool, that authority would crumble. He would lose everything he had worked for, everything he had stood for, and it would be her fault. The curse was not in sudden death. It was in this slow, insidious erosion of a good man's life. The decision, when it came, felt as inevitable as the setting of the sun. It was an act of profound love. The only gift she felt she had left to give him his freedom. She had to leave, to disappear, so that he could reclaim his life, his honor, his place in the town that needed him. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart, but she held on to it with a grim resolve. That night, she waited until he was asleep, his breathing deep and steady in the quiet house. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had laid down his badge, and by the light of a single candle. She wrote. It was not a long letter. Her hand trembled, and her tears blurred the ink on the cheap paper. She wrote, "My dearest Eli, thank you. You gave me back my life. Now I must give you back yours. Do not look for me. Do not grieve for me. Think of me only as a passing storm that is now gone, leaving the sky clear for you. I will pray for your happiness always. Yours, Lila." She folded the note and placed it on his pillow, her fingers brushing his hair for a fraction of a second. She took nothing with her but the clothes on her back and the small bundle she had arrived with. She slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, a ghost, leaving the only home she had known. The air was cold, and the vast, empty plains that stretched out before her looked like a sea of ink. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to go. Eli woke to a silence that was wrong. The house was cold. The familiar scent of coffee was absent. He saw the folded note on the pillow beside him, and a cold dread seized him before he even opened it. He read the words, and the floor seemed to drop out from beneath him. He had faced down mobs and murderers, but this quiet, selfless act of sacrifice shattered him. He understood instantly why she had done it, and the purity of her motive was a fresh wound in his heart. She was trying to save him, just as he had tried to save her. He did not hesitate. He threw on his clothes, his movements clumsy with urgency. He saddled his horse, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. He knew which way she would have gone. There was only one road out of Dusthaven that led anywhere, a long, lonely track that wound its way through the Badlands. The sky was still dark, but a familiar wind was beginning to rise, a dry, gritty breath that promised another dust storm. He rode for hours, his eyes scanning the endless, featureless landscape. The sun rose, a merciless white orb in a hazy sky. The wind grew stronger, whipping sand into his face, stinging his eyes. He was following a ghost, a set of footprints that the wind was determined to erase. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, he saw her, a small, solitary figure, leaning into the wind, her progress slow and painful. She was a tiny speck of defiance against the immense, hostile emptiness of the desert. He galloped to her, dismounting before his horse had even come to a full stop. He ran to her, grabbing her by the shoulders. The wind tore at them, a physical force trying to rip them apart. Her face was caked with dust, Her lips cracked, but her eyes were filled with a terrible, heartbreaking resolve. She shouted over the roar of the wind, "You must let me go. It is the only way. If I stay, you will lose everything. Your badge, your good name, the respect of the town. You will lose it all because of me." He pulled her closer, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away the dusty tears she did not know she was crying. He looked into her eyes, forcing her to see the truth in his. He shouted back, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I already lost my badge the day I laid it on the table. My name means nothing without you, and the respect of the town is worthless if it means I have to live without you. If you leave, I do not lose everything. If you leave, I lose my soul." The words, a raw cry from the very center of his being, broke through her resolve. The fear she had carried for a lifetime, the belief in her own cursed nature, finally crumbled into dust and was carried away by the wind. She saw not a man bewitched, but a man who had made his choice, a man who was choosing her, fully and completely, over everything else. She collapsed against him, her fight gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of homecoming. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if he could physically shield her from all the sorrows of the world. They stood there for a long time, two small figures locked in an embrace as the dust storm raged around them, a maelstrom of sand and wind that blotted out the sun and sky. The world was a formless, chaotic void, but in the heart of that storm, they had found their center, their anchor, their unshakable truth. When the worst of the storm had passed, leaving the air thick and the light a strange, bruised yellow, they started back. He put her on his horse and walked beside her. They did not speak. There were no more words to say. He simply reached up and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his. Their grip was firm, a silent promise made in the heart of the desolate land. They were going home, together. The journey back to Dust Haven was a pilgrimage through a changed world. The dust storm had scoured the landscape, leaving it raw and exposed. But the air was clean, stripped of its haze. They moved through a profound silence, broken only by the plodding of the horse and the whisper of the wind. Their clasped hands were a silent conversation, an anchor in the vast emptiness. They were no longer two separate people, a lonely sheriff and a cursed woman. They were a single entity, forged in fire and fear, and bound by a truth that needed no words. As they crested the last rise that overlooked the town, a sense of fragile peace settled over Eli. He saw the familiar cluster of buildings, the thin tendrils of smoke rising from chimneys, and for the first time, it looked like a place he could truly call home. But the peace was a thin sheet of ice over a dark, deep river. From the west, a small group of riders appeared, moving with a purpose that was not peaceful. They were not from Dust Haven. Their clothes were different, their manner harder, and at their head, a figure sat slumped in his saddle, a figure Eli recognized with a jolt of pure, cold shock. It was Reed. He was not dead. A lucky ledge, a thicket of stubborn brush. Something had broken his fall. He was a nightmare returned from the grave, his head wrapped in a bloody bandage, his face a grotesque mask of fury and pain. The men with him were not ranchers, they were killers, their eyes hard and empty, guns worn with the ease of long practice. They had seen Eli and Lila on the rise, two exposed figures against the skyline. There was no escape. Eli's voice was a low, urgent command. He told Lila to get down, to run for the cover of the rocks 100 yards away. He pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard, his mind instantly clear. All his pain and weariness burned away by the searing heat of imminent danger. This was not a mob to be reasoned with. This was a final reckoning. Lila scrambled from the horse, her eyes wide with terror, but she did not run. She ducked behind the horse, pulling the small derringer from her dress pocket, its tiny frame looking like a toy in her trembling hand. She would not leave him. Not again. Reed's voice, a ragged shred of a shout, carried on the wind. He screamed Carter, his voice cracking with hate. He yelled that he had told him this would happen, that the witch had brought death with her. His men spread out, forming a deadly crescent. The first shot was not from Eli. It was from one of the hired guns. A puff of smoke followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet whined past Eli's ear, close enough for him to feel its heat. He returned fire. His shot aimed not to kill but to drive them back, to buy Lila time. But they were not frightened townspeople. They were professionals. They advanced steadily, using the sparse cover of rocks and scrub brush, their fire methodical and accurate. The world devolved into a chaotic symphony of violence, the air filled with the roar of gunfire, the high-pitched scream of ricocheting bullets, and the panicked snorting of the horse. Eli was a master of his craft, a man who knew the deadly geometry of a gunfight. He moved with a grim economy, firing, ducking, reloading, his body a shield between the advancing death and the woman huddled behind his horse. He felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his arm, a hot line of fire that he ignored. His focus was absolute. Keep Lila safe. He saw an opening, a moment when two of the men were reloading. He shouted for Lila to run now, to make for the rocks. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her eyes locked on his. In that moment of shared gaze, an entire lifetime of love and fear passed between them. Then she turned and ran, her small form a desperate prayer against the harsh landscape. Her movement drew their fire. Two rifles cracked at once. Eli saw the puffs of dust where the bullets struck the ground, just behind her heels. He stood up from his cover, deliberately making himself a target, and fired two quick shots, forcing the men to duck, giving her another precious second. It was then that he felt it, a massive, crushing blow to his chest, as if he had been kicked by a horse. The world went silent for a moment, the roar of the guns replaced by a strange, internal ringing. He looked down and saw a dark, blossoming flower of red spreading across his shirt. He staggered but did not fall. He would not fall. He turned his body, his back to Lila, his face to the men who had shot him, and raised his rifle one more time. Lila had reached the rocks. She turned back, and a scream was torn from her throat. She saw him standing there, a lone, defiant figure, swaying on his feet, his shirt soaked with blood. She saw the grim satisfaction on Reed's face as he raised his own pistol for the killing shot. All the fear, all the passivity that had defined her life, was burned away in that instant, replaced by a ferocious, protective rage. She looked around, her eyes wild, and saw the lantern she had used on their journey, still tied to the saddle of Eli's horse. With a cry that was part fury and part despair, she ran back toward the horse. Ignoring the bullets that whined past her, she fumbled with the ties, her fingers clumsy with haste. She found a match in the saddlebag, struck it, and lit the wick. Reed, seeing her, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He thought she was surrendering, bringing him a light. He was wrong. She swung the lit lantern in a wide arc and threw it with all her strength. It sailed through the air, a small, fiery comet, and shattered against the rocks just in front of Reed's horse. The oil exploded in a whoosh of flame. The horse, a creature of instinct and fear, screamed in terror. It reared, its eyes white with panic, and spun, trying to escape the sudden, terrifying fire. Reed, caught off guard, his leg tangled in the reins, was torn from the saddle. He was dragged for a few feet, his one desperate cry lost in the chaos before the panicked horse plunged over the edge of the same ravine that had failed to claim him once before. This time, there was no lucky ledge. There was only the long fall, and then silence. The hired guns, their leader gone, their payment now a matter of speculation, had no more stomach for the fight. They exchanged a look, and as one, they mounted their horses and galloped away, melting back into the prairie, leaving only the dead and the dying behind. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been. Lila ran to Eli. He was on the ground now, the last of his strength gone. He lay in the dust, his blood a stark, crimson stain upon the thirsty earth. She fell to her knees beside him, gathering him into her arms, his head resting in her lap. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, looking at something far away. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. She smoothed the hair back from his forehead, her tears falling freely now, mingling with the blood on his skin. She pressed her cheek to his, her voice a broken, desperate plea that was wrenched from the deepest part of her soul. "Do not you die for me, Eli." She repeated it over and over, a mantra against the coming darkness. "Please, not for me, do not you die." As she held him, she felt a drop of water on her hand, then another. She looked up at the sky, which a moment before had been a clear, brutal blue. It was now a mass of dark, churning clouds that had gathered as if from nowhere. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. The drops became a trickle, and then the trickle became a deluge. A torrential, cleansing rain began to fall, a storm of biblical proportions that hammered the ground, turning the dust to mud, washing the gunpowder from the air. Eli's eyes flickered and focused on her face. He gave a faint, weak smile. He whispered, "Rain." The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. The whole town, it seemed, drawn by the sound of the gunfight, was coming. They stopped at the edge of the field, a silent, horrified gallery of witnesses. They saw their sheriff, bleeding his life out onto the ground. They saw the woman they had called a witch, cradling him, her face a mask of fierce, protective love. They saw the body of their true tormentor, a speck at the bottom of the ravine, and they saw the rain, the impossible, miraculous rain, pouring down as if the heavens themselves were weeping. It was Reverend Michael who moved first. The old preacher walked slowly into the field, his face streaked with rain and tears. He knelt in the mud beside Lila and Eli, and he began to pray, his voice quavering but strong, a prayer of thanksgiving, of repentance, of hope, one by one. The townspeople followed his example: Samuel the blacksmith, Jebediah the store owner, and the tanner's wife. They sank to their knees in the muddy field, their heads bowed, their faces washed clean by the storm. They were not praying to a distant, wrathful God. They were praying to the fierce, undeniable power of the love and sacrifice they were witnessing. A murmur went through the kneeling crowd, a whisper that became a certainty. "The curse is broken. God has washed the curse away." Lila felt a strange, light sensation bubble up inside her, a feeling so alien she did not at first recognize it. Through her tears, through her terror for Eli's life, she began to laugh. It was not a sound of hysteria or madness. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated, miraculous joy. It was the sound of a soul set free, of a burden lifted, of a life beginning anew in the heart of a storm. She looked down at Eli, and his eyes were still open, watching her, a look of profound love on his face. He was alive. He was going to live. The rain poured down, washing the blood from the ground, soaking the repentant townspeople, plastering Lila's hair to her face. It was a force of nature, a moment of divine, violent grace. The light broke through the clouds, striking the falling rain and creating a brilliant, shimmering curtain of light around them all. In that moment, in that crucible of blood, rain, and light, a town was reborn. It was no longer a haven for dust and fear. It was a place of forgiveness. And as the people rose from their knees to help carry their wounded sheriff home, they knew, with an unshakable certainty, that their town would need a new name. They would call it Blessing Creek. The year that followed was a quiet season of becoming. The land, soaked by the great rain, healed itself with a fierce and stubborn vitality. The creek, which had been a dry, stony scar for so long, now flowed with a clear, steady current, and its name, Blessing Creek, was spoken by the townspeople not as a novelty, but as a simple statement of fact. The blackened bones of the old grain warehouse had been cleared away, and in its place, the town, working together, had raised the frames of a new schoolhouse and a proper church, their fresh-cut pines scenting the air with the promise of a future. Leila's infirmary was in a small, clean room attached to the general store, a space Jebediah had offered with a humility that was as profound as his earlier accusations had been loud. It smelled of camphor, lavender, and drying mint. Here, she was not a witch or a healer of supernatural repute. She was a teacher. Twice a week, the women of the town would gather, their hands, once calloused only by farm work and laundry, now learning the delicate art of grinding herbs, of steeping teas, of making salves and poultices. She taught them what she knew, demystifying her skills, turning her once feared knowledge into a shared community resource. She was giving away the very thing that had once isolated her, and in doing so, she was weaving herself into the very fabric of the town. Eli was still the sheriff, but the man who wore the badge was not the same. The hard, brittle shell of grief he had carried for a decade had been shattered, and what was left was a man made stronger by his scars. He walked his rounds with a lighter step, his authority resting not on the colt that still hung at his hip, but on the deep, quiet respect he had earned. He still kept the peace, but his justice was now tempered with a wisdom that could not be found in any law book. He settled a dispute over a stray calf not with threats, but with calm words and an appeal to the better natures of the men involved. He saw the fear and foolishness that drove people to wrongdoing, and he met it not with rigid judgment, but with a firm and compassionate understanding. The small house he had once shared with Mary, and then with her ghost, was now filled with the light and warmth of Lila's presence, and he had finally, truly, come home. One afternoon in the golden light of late summer, they worked together at the old well behind his house, the place where their hands had first touched. The old wooden frame had rotted, and they were building a new one. Eli drove the post, his movements strong and sure, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving with a familiar rhythm. Lila packed the earth around it, her hands firm and steady, her face smudged with dirt. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements a practiced dance. When they were finished, they stood back to admire their work. The new stone and wood structure was simple, solid, and built to last. Eli cranked the handle, and a bucket of cold, clear water rose from the depths. They leaned over the edge of the well, their shoulders brushing, and looked down. In the still surface of the water, the late afternoon sun created a perfect, shimmering mirror. It held them both, their faces side by side, serene in the liquid glass. They saw not a weary lawman and a haunted woman, but a man and a woman at peace, their reflections rippling together, becoming one. A voice, deep and familiar, broke the quiet moment. "Well now, Sheriff, if you keep making improvements like this, folks might start thinking you aim to stay a while." They turned. It was Samuel, the blacksmith, his big bluff frame leaning against a nearby fence post. He was not alone. Anne and her son, Thomas, were with him, as were a half-dozen other townspeople. They had not come as a group, but had simply drifted over, drawn by the simple, peaceful sight of the two of them working. There was no suspicion in their eyes, only a quiet, friendly curiosity. Samuel grinned, a wide, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He looked at Lila, his gaze direct and filled with a profound, if unspoken, apology. He said, "My wife sends her thanks for the headache powder. Works better than anything the doctor ever gave her." He shook his head, a look of wry disbelief on his face. He looked around at the others, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "She was cursed." "Huh," he said, a deep chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Then may we all be so cursed." A ripple of soft laughter went through the small crowd. It was a gentle, healing sound. The old, ugly word had been robbed of its power, transformed from a brand of shame into a badge of honor. Lila looked at the faces of the people who had once wanted to burn her out of her home, and she saw only neighbors. She smiled, a true, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. The old wound was still there, a faint, silvery scar on her soul. But for the first time, it did not ache. Eli laid a hand on her shoulder, his touch a warm, solid weight. He looked at Samuel, at the faces of the town, and then his eyes came to rest on Lila's. "A blessing," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air, "can only exist where someone dares to believe in it." As if on cue, a new sound rolled across the prairie, the clear, resonant ringing of a bell. It was not the frantic clang of an alarm, but the steady, joyful peal from the steeple of the new church, calling the faithful to an evening prayer. It was a sound of community, of order, of peace. It rang out over the newly green fields, over the quiet streets, a benediction that washed away the last lingering echoes of fear and prejudice. The townspeople began to drift away, their goodbyes soft on the evening air, leaving Eli and Lila alone again in the gathering twilight. They stood for a long time, not speaking, simply being together. They looked out toward the western horizon, where the sky was a breathtaking canvas of orange and purple. In the distance, a herd of wild horses, their manes and tails streaming in the gentle breeze, galloped across the plains. They were a vision of pure, untamed freedom, a beautiful and enduring part of the land they all shared. Lila leaned her head against Eli's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They were not two broken people clinging to each other for survival anymore. They were two whole souls who had found their other half. They had faced the worst of the human heart and had answered it with the best of their own. They had walked through the fire and had not been consumed. They had weathered the storm and had found the calm on the other side. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him. The setting sun was reflected in their eyes, two small, golden flames. Below them, the well was a dark, still circle, holding the cool, clear water that gave them life. Above them, the sky was a vast, open promise of tomorrow. The clear water in the well, the endless blue of the sky above, and the quiet, certain universe that existed in the space between their eyes. It was enough. It was everything. The story of Blessing Creek became a quiet legend, a tale told not in grand pronouncements, but in the everyday actions of its people. The raw, desperate edge of survival that had defined life in Dust Haven was gone, replaced by a gentler, more resilient spirit. The salvation they had found did not come in a flash of divine intervention or a stroke of miraculous luck. It had been earned, cultivated in the hard soil of their own failings, and watered by the simple, profound courage of two people who refused to let fear have the last word. The central, unspoken truth of their new life was a lesson learned in fire and blood that no one is truly cursed, but that people, in their fear of what they do not understand, will often curse one another. Eli Carter had learned to forgive himself. The ghost of his wife, Mary, no longer haunted the corners of his house with accusations of failure. He now remembered her with a gentle, aching love, a love that was a part of the man he was, the man who had been shaped by that loss. He understood that his rigid adherence to the law, his solitary, stoic existence, had been a kind of penance, a wall he had built around his own heart. Lila had not just breached that wall. She had shown him that true justice was not about punishment, but about understanding, and that the deepest laws were not written in books, but in the human capacity for compassion. His love for Lila did not betray his memory of Mary. It honored the man she had helped him to become. Lila, in turn, had learned to believe in herself. The brand of the outcast, which she had worn for so long that it had felt like a part of her skin, had faded into a faint scar. She moved through the town with a quiet confidence, her hands no longer things she feared, but instruments of healing and comfort. The infirmary was her sanctuary, a place where she could practice her art without fear or superstition. She saw the fear of sickness in the eyes of the mothers who brought their children to her, and she recognized it as the same fear that had once nearly destroyed her. But now, She could meet that fear not with her own terror, but with calm knowledge and a reassuring touch. She had finally accepted that the curse had never been inside her. It had been in the eyes of those who looked at her. By refusing to see it anymore, she had made it disappear. The symbols of their ordeal had been transformed. The wind, which had once been the devil's breath, carrying whispers of prejudice and hate, was now just the wind. A cooling breeze that rustled the leaves of the new cottonwood trees planted along the creek. The rain, which had fallen like a torrent of judgment and a baptism of forgiveness, was now a welcome friend, nurturing the gardens and fields that fed them all. And the water, which had been a symbol of a community's dying faith, now flowed freely, a constant reminder of life's ability to renew itself. The structure of their story had come full circle, beginning and ending at the well behind Eli's house. The place where a simple touch had sparked a world of fear and confusion was now a testament to their endurance. Its new stone frame solid and dependable. It was no longer just a place to draw water. It was a place that held their history, a monument to the moment a potential death had been transformed into a source of life. Theirs was a story that spoke to the deepest values of a hard land, a testament to justice, mercy, and the enduring power of love in the darkest of corners. It did not carry the thrill of a saloon gunfight or the glory of a range war. Its impact was quieter, a gentle echo that resonated in the soul, a story that was sad but left you warm, a reminder that even in a world of dust and hardship, grace could find a place to bloom. She was never cursed. It was the world that had forgotten how to believe in grace. Eli stood with Lila on the porch of their home, the home he had built for one, but which was now a sanctuary for two. The first light of a new day was breaking over the horizon, painting the vast, empty canvas of the sky with strokes of rose and gold. A new era was dawning, not just for the day, but for the town, for the people, and for them. It was an era built not on myth or superstition, but on the simple, powerful conviction that the best of human nature could, and would, triumph over the worst. He looked out at the endless horizon, at the promise of the rising sun, and then he looked at her, and he knew he was finally, completely, home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.